It's time for Pure Performance.
Get your stopwatches ready. It's time for Pure Performance with Andy Grabner and Brian Wilson. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Pure Performance. Today, we have another show, don't we, Andy Grabner? How are you?
We do, Brian Wilson. Why do we talk that strangely today?
Because I have to do something different every show, sort of, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. Keeps it unique.
Yes.
What's new today? I think it's the first day this year. Well, I'm in Boston right now, and we have 31 degrees Celsius outside, and it is mid of May, and so 31 Celsius is a lot. So that's nice for people that don't do Celsius. I think it's like 90, close to 90.
I know people who do centigrade, but not Celsius. That's a bad joke.
Yeah. Well, let's. Anyway, so what do we do today? We have a new episode.
Yes, another 101 episode.
And actually, I have the interviewer sitting next to me. The interviewer is another colleague of mine working in the Innovation Lab out of Linz, but happened to be in Boston today. Klaus Enzenhofer. Hi.
Hi. How are you?
Good. Well, we're both. Hopefully, after this we can enjoy a little bit of the sunshine.
Mm-hmm.
We brought Klaus on the podcast, Brian, because we wanted to talk about two new things that we've heard.
Right. And
what is it?
But before we go there, Klaus, do you remember our first encounter? To put you on the spot, our first date, if you will.
The first time the two of us met was in New York.
Well, Jersey City, technically, yes, but then we went for a beer afterward.
We had a beer, and it was a good evening.
Yeah. Anyhow, that was a long time ago. So anyway.
5 years, something like that.
Yeah, I've been here. No, yeah, probably closer to 5, because next September I think will be my 6th year here. So yeah, quite a long time. We're getting old.
Okay.
Speaking of getting old,
we're only getting wiser. We're getting wiser, not just old, wiser.
Yeah. Well, this intro is getting old, so.
Yeah. Go ahead. So we are going to, we asked Klaus to join us today because part of our one-on-one series, we wanted to talk about two new ways to, I think, measure and evaluate performance for end users on websites, mobile applications. We talk about visually complete and also about speed index.
I love these metrics, by the way. That's why I'm clapping.
Cool. And so for people that have no clue about these new metrics, that have always thought about website performance and page load, Klaus, do you want to enlighten us a little bit? Maybe start with the first, visually complete.
Yeah, actually, they are not that new. Visually Complete exists for a while already. Mm-hmm. But with Dynatrace, we brought it into the real user monitoring space. So Visually Complete is all about getting into the seat of the user, trying to capture what he sees on his device, whether it's a desktop or mobile device. Mm-hmm. So how long does it take effectively to render everything that is in this visible part of the screen? People are talking about above the fold when they speak about it. And lately, this has become a more and more important metric because the good old response time that we looked at became kind of invalid depending on new technologies like single page applications where the whole loading behavior is so much different that you had this response time eventually triggering really, really early, and you had basically you left the user with an empty screen. Not really useful, right? This tears down a little bit the user experience. Or the other way around, you had really fast, you were done with the visible area, but then you were loading like a gazillion of tracking pixels and some other stuff that is not relevant to the user at all and doesn't change the layout, but it kind of defers the triggering of the regular response time.
It also sounds like that would also make it very difficult to compare your page performance versus your competitors, or maybe even an older version. If you made some changes, that comparison would be kind of tough, because there might be a lot of inconsequential things going on that have no impact. And I think that's kind of where we're going with this Visually Complete, right?
Right, absolutely. So with Visually Complete, you now are able to compare yourself with your competitor. I mean, everybody knows how his own website is constructed. If not, then try to find it out. But how the website of your competition is constructed, you never know. And this with Visually Complete, you're kind of independent of how this whole thing gets constructed. You're always getting, this is the screen, this is the time it took till the screen was done.
Mm-hmm. And so I think, because you mentioned that it has been around for a while, but we brought it to real user monitoring. That means initially it came out of synthetic monitoring.
Right, absolutely. You're absolutely right. So originally Patrick Meenan was bringing this capability up. And the thing was, in order to get this Visually Complete metric, with synthetic, they really took screenshots, real screenshots, and compared those screenshots. And once the screenshots were no longer changing, then basically the metric triggered.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. And we with our Dynatrace solution brought it now to real user monitoring. We took a JavaScript-based approach to capture basically, are all the elements in the visible area ready for the user, yes or no? It's a much more lightweight solution. So you're now really getting into the real user seat, less of the synthetic one where you're driving a synthetic machine. It's a good first indicator, but you never know what's going on with your users out there. Think of mobile devices.
Right.
Yeah. And that's... I think we need to work on our synchronization here. Because you mentioned Pat Meenan, and I have just Brian. We should post a link on this. Pat Meenan,
former guest of the show.
He wrote a blog about this, how web page test is actually. So web page test, the testing tool, synthetic, and he has a nice explanation of both. Actually, Visually Complete and Speed Index. We come to Speed Index in a second. But you can really see here in his time frame where he shows how much percentage of the page was actually loaded after, let's say, a second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, and when is then the page visually complete. Yeah, that makes sense.
So in terms of Visually Complete, right? You know, we've had within Dynatrace for a while now. We've had a time called perceived render time, and I'm sure other tools out there have their own proprietary sort of above the fold rendering measures. What does the switch to something like Visually Complete mean, or why is using Visually Complete as opposed to our own or anybody else's own homegrown version of that important?
So perceived render time is something that tried to measure exactly the same thing, but we did it around the year 2006. If you take a look at how browsers evolved from 2006 to today, the insight that you can get via JavaScript APIs into the browser are just completely different. And perceived render time was a good metric. It really worked well, but it's now kind of outdated because we have now more visibility. We can get more accurate to what the real user experience is here, and getting more accurate timings here.
Cool. So Visually Complete, and if I rephrase this again, what for me, the way I understand it, if you look at the page and let's say the page takes 5 seconds to load, let's say 2 pages both take 5 seconds to load, but it could mean that they are loading in a different way, right? You said earlier the HTML document might be downloaded in 5 milliseconds, but then until everything else comes in. That's why we really want to make sure that we measure these 5 seconds and not just take the page load time or the download time, which can also be wrong, as the right measure. So really looking at when does the user really see the page above the fold to be fully rendered.
That's absolutely correct. But I wouldn't downplay all the other metrics because they have their use cases.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So if you are into tracking how often somebody clicks on your ad, then it's relevant for you that the ad is there and the tracking script is actually loaded in order to be paid at the end. So you would probably then take the good old response time again, because that makes sure everything actually got loaded. Or if you are into search engine optimization, Google is talking about leveraging now this visually complete metric as the metric for performance. That's something they put performance as something I have to extend here a little bit, because search engine optimization is not a big IT topic, but there is something about how Google ranks their results on the website, and those results are actually influenced by the performance of the website. And they used to look at the time to first byte, which they are at the moment still, but the next step is let's look at how long does it take for the above the fold area to load, which is basically visually complete. And that's a metric that's one of the few things that are really communicated by Google as influencing the search rank. Yeah, and that's why, for example, time to first byte can be equally important as visually complete. It really depends.
And it sounds like that with visually complete, you mentioned like the full page load time, which is going to have a meaning for something like the advertising and keeping up with those things. But what it's really sounding like to me is that visually complete is a lot more tied to that. I don't know if we'll ever have the magic answer, but it seems a lot more closely related to that. What is it my user sees? You know, I go in a lot of engagements, and when we talk to any of the business owners, and they're like, well, how do we measure the user's impression of the page, right? And using something like onload, as you're mentioning, isn't quite really getting there. It sounds to me that something like visually complete is a lot closer to that magical metric of what the user is experiencing.
And I guess, as you also said, I think, Klaus, it also works beautifully for single page apps.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. So especially the initial load, first of all, but then also when you interact with the app and you click, let's say, on a link, and then something changes, we basically measure how long does it take until the fully UI is rendered again of the change.
Right. The visible part again. So the thing is, single page application, as you know, it's a single page load, so W3C navigation timings, you don't have them there available. But you have there your triggers, you have your click actions that you handle in your JavaScript. And then, you go off, load something from the server side, maybe another image, JSON object that tells you to do whatever with the UI. And then you change the UI based on what is coming back. And we used to be able to see basically the click plus the first request, but this changing of the DOM and the changing of the whole appearance of the website, this is something that now Visually Complete can capture. This is where we have extended our capability. Again, we want to always be as close as possible to what the user is at the end experiencing. And this really helped a lot.
And can we reveal some of the implementation actually? So you said we're using JavaScript.
Now we are getting in a critical area because we are getting a patent on it.
Oh, okay. Well then, no, I don't want to. But just to confirm, so what we do, we use JavaScript for that.
We use JavaScript, and I can say that we are using the Mutation Observer API. But as I said, there is a patent.
That's okay. Then we're doing it obviously in a lightweight way, because overhead is always a question.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, not to put you on the spot, Klaus, because we don't have to dive into it. But as somebody once said to me, if you have a patent for it, it'll be public, and it'll be public. So anyway, we'll not go into it right now, though.
Yeah. Cool. So that was visually complete. The first metric, be more accurate in really measuring how long it really takes until the page is fully rendered. Now the second metric is speed index. What is speed index?
Speed index basically explains how fast the visible area actually gets rendered, each part. So there is, let's say we have 2 pages, both have visually complete after 8 seconds, which is pretty slow, but let's assume 8 seconds. Then the question is how fast did the user really see something, and how fast were the bigger parts of the website ready. In speed index is actually looking at the percentage of the visible area. It looks at graphs. Basically, is a lot of the visible area really early on done, or is it really late? And this really helps then to understand the loading of the page. So how the path to the visual complete.
So basically, if I take your 8 seconds example, I enter the URL, in 7 seconds nothing happens, and then boom, everything is here within a second. So loads in 8 seconds, but as a user I'm frustrated for 7. Alternative example, 90% of the page loads within the first second, and then the rest loads within the next 7 seconds. From a user perspective, it's a much better way of this is much faster, even though fully loaded still same time.
Right. And Andy, to counter that with one more use case, which I think is important here, right? Because your first use case was like nothing was happening. And this kind of goes back to that documentation that we'll have linked on there for visually complete and speed index. The other use case is, let's say 25% loads in the very beginning, and then the other 75% doesn't load until the end. That's going to have a lower, that'll be somewhere in between the nothing and the a bunch up front. Because yes, you get a quick hit on the user that something's happening, but then it stalls and all the main components don't really come in. So it's really, I don't want to say tricky, but it's critical in getting useful and impactful data up front first, as opposed to just maybe painting of backgrounds and box outlines and then pausing for a long time.
So people are often asking me, what is a good value for a speed index, or what is a good value for visually complete? And I always say, like, those two metrics are really working together. Visually complete and speed index should be quite apart, because the earlier on you have speed index, let's say our 8 second example, speed index tells you like it's 1.2 seconds. This is then a good metric, because that means that a lot of the stuff is already early on visible. Whereas 8 seconds example again, if you have a speed index of 7.5 seconds, this is a bad example. This means you have for a very long time, nothing visible, and then you get everything, like you explained it. So they really work together here.
And so speed index. So that means, and obviously the reasons to speed these things up, we would go back to our regular web performance optimization. So why is nothing happening for so long? Maybe we had some blocking JavaScript. We have whatever else, maybe some blocking third-party components that come in, and something like that. That would be good indicators. Also optimizing the page again to defer loading of content that is not visible or not necessary for the event. These are all the regular things. We fall back to that.
So speaking of that point, Andy, then the question I wanted to ask Klaus about this is, let's say you have an above the fold page, or an above the fold section that has like your Twitter and your Facebook and Instagram, and I guess I have to say what's the one the kids use, WhatsApp, or whatever it is. Yeah, whatever. It has all those little bits, all those little beacons on them. Now, if let's say you did follow the good performance optimization and say we'll only put those in on load, but it's still above the fold, how does that play into visually complete?
Yeah, it depends how you integrate the whole social media, and there are multiple ways how you can integrate it.
But does visually complete take into account like what happens after onload, or?
Yeah, sure it does.
Okay.
So it doesn't stop with onload. So it would, if you change something in the UI, then it would still capture that.
Okay, so that's where speed index, I guess, would be a critical counterpart to that, even more so than normal.
Now, Klaus, so these are basically the two key metrics, right? So speed index and visually complete. Now, earlier you said something about, right, certain people in the organization, maybe marketing, they have a different opinion on what is critical for them, right? So, for instance, loading that particular ad. I believe W3C specifies the markers.
The markers. Yep.
So how can you explain this a little bit? Because this kind of helps actually extend these two metrics with custom metrics, right?
Right. You can always extend and measure what is critical to you. If you have developers that know exactly what is the critical thing for marketing that needs to be loaded or for your business actually, then you can place there some markers using JavaScript. We would pick them up and you could leverage those and tell Dynatrace, hey, that's my new key metric. That's my new key performance metric. Another example that I often come across is DOM Interactive. People, there is one thing to have everything visible in your area, but let's say you're a booking platform. You try to book your travel and you try to enter a date because, when you travel, you have to enter a date. And what happens if your calendar doesn't show up? You cannot pick from the calendar. So that means this critical JavaScript is not there, or is still the website itself is still being blocked because of other things going on, being loaded. So DOM Interactive can be here a really critical metric as well, because it tells you when can I interact with the website. Really depends on your website. You have to pick your key performance metric, but they are all important the one or the other way.
Cool. And you said so the way we influenced our own product in Dynatrace UEM, we allow people to pick and choose what the key metric is for them, and not only I think in general for the whole application we monitor, but actually per user.
Per user action group. So you can decide basically, let's take the e-commerce example. Looking at a product detail page versus getting a search result list. You might want to have there a different threshold on how fast that should be. Or let's say you want to measure how long it takes till autocomplete shows up when you start typing a search term into the search field. You would probably wait for the autocomplete maybe a couple of milliseconds to show up. Whereas for a complete product detail page with video and everything that you want, you would accept maybe like 5 seconds even, because people know there is more stuff coming. Still, they try to get it as fast as possible.
Yeah, and I wanted to even mention going back to the performance marks that came out, Andy, I think as a result of the webinar we did together. Right. And I had no idea these things existed. And the question what came up about these user timing performance marks, which is where, as you all said, you can customize any kind of mark in the code that you want. And I just loved when we looked into it, we found out that we actually do capture those already. So I'm just bringing it up because it made me very happy. And I like to talk about happy things.
So Klaus is currently pulling up some data here, which reminds me I have to ask him another question. Thanks for the hint. Thanks for the hint. So we know that as much as I love my iPhone, Safari has been known as a browser that did not always support the latest and greatest W3C specifications. How about Visually Complete and Speed Index? Is this something that I can only get on Chrome? Or does it also work on other browsers?
No, it works actually on all the new browsers because the thing that we are leveraging, as I said, is the Mutation Observer API. And that one is available besides the Opera Mini on every modern browser.
Okay, cool. That's good. So that's finally good news for the Apple users out there.
Except for all the Opera Mini users.
That's
right. That's right, Joe. I'm talking to you.
So different. Sorry. Opera Mini is working just so fundamentally different from all the other browsers, so you cannot have their Visual Complete.
And by the way, I wanna let the audience know. Klaus has been using a website here that's called caniuse.com.
It's an awesome site. You can ask questions. Can I use any browser API. Can I use W3C timings, whatever. It's really great. It tells you basically which browsers are supporting it, gives you a global coverage. Basically, what does it mean? Like for the Mutation Observer API, we have a global coverage of 93.54%, for example. This means Opera Mini is the biggest part that is missing, and some older versions of IE slash Edge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. So caniuse.com, that's a nice page to look at, especially I guess for developers as well, so that they understand what they can use in a browser. Wow. Brian, did we so I think we covered the 2 metrics, also learned about the performance marks. Anything else we wanted to bring up?
No, I mean, I think just in general, the question would then kind of come up as like, well, how do I improve things, right? And not that we need to go in deep or anything like that, because that's a whole, expertise field. But, just the idea of, getting some of those key elements, maybe put it inline. I know you can do some of your CSS inline. There was something about, what was it, base 64 images or some kind of weirdness, whatever that piece is. Doing whatever you can to get some of that data up and on your page as soon as possible is really going to help, especially for that visual, the speed index part. And the only time, I thought about it a little while too when Klaus was talking about the distance between speed index and visually complete. How if you're visually complete as far, you really want, or a good gap between the two is good, right? Obviously, if your page loads in 1 second, it's not going to matter too much. But let's face it, this day and age, what page loads in 1 second anymore? So these things are really, really important. And I just really want to give my hats off to the team at Dynatrace for getting all this stuff in, because it's at least for me, who spent a lot of time on that front end side with some of our integrations. It's really exciting to see these in here. So thanks to that.
Yeah. And also we have to thank obviously the initial creators of that. So Pat Meenan and Steve Souders was also a big proponent and implementing that.
And I would like to thank my wife as well, because she always so thoughtfully leaves the room when I do a podcast to give us some quiet. So thanks, Megan.
Cool. Wow, that was nice, straight to the point. I think hopefully people understand visually complete and speed index better now. Klaus, we would love to have you back also for other episodes, because I know you're doing a lot of stuff around user experience monitoring, real user monitoring. You just came off a webinar with Panera Bread.
Yeah,
where they talk about how they use real user monitoring to connect all the different channels that their customers are using, right, from tablet to kiosk and everything.
Happy to come back whenever you have time. Let me know.
Yeah.
I wonder if we'll have time ever. Wink, wink. Any last words from anybody then before we wrap up here? This is going to be under 30 minutes. If we got 2 minutes to keep it under 30 minutes.
It's going to be a record. No, the only thing I want to say, we bring out the links on the website. Klaus, how can we find you on Twitter? What's your Twitter handle?
That's a good one. Put a link on your site. It's KEncenhofer. So
we'll put
KENCENHOFER.
Perfect. And I think, Brian, that's it for me. It's great that we have this one-on-one series, and we continue recording more of those.
Yep. And
that's it from my side.
All right, and any suggestions you have for another 101 topic, we'd love to hear it you can tweet us at pure_DT or email us at pureperformance@dynatrace.com. And we'd also love to hear how maybe if you are already using Visually Complete and Speed Index, how you might be using them, especially if you have any great stories around them. Maybe you can be a guest. Klaus, any last words from you?
No, I just really appreciate it. I just ask myself, why did it take us so long to get the first one kicked off?
We've asked you, but I don't know. I'm not sure who to blame, but I think you just want to stretch it now so that we actually cross the 30-minute mark.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up then.
All right.
Going for a new record. Bye.